All right, good evening and welcome to News Talk 830 WCCO. My name is Henry Lake and we are excited to have you join us for the continuation of our Race and Racism conversation series, In the Room Where It Happened. Conversations on racism that matter to all of us. Not only can you listen to us on the radio, you can also listen via the Odyssey app or check us out on our Facebook page with a video stream. Now I'd like to introduce to you our host, Dr. Verna Price, who will lead our conversation tonight and introduce our guest on the panel. Dr. Price, always a pleasure to chat with you tonight.
Well, it's a pleasure to see you again. Thanks for coming on to the show for another time. This is your second round. I really appreciate it.
Is it second or third? I've been here I've had a couple of times.
I know. So I really appreciate that you keep coming back. And thank you so much. As I said when we were off the air, I'm not exactly sure how tonight's show is going to go, but I do know it's going to be an important one for all of us. And the reason being that last Tuesday, April 20th, at approximately 4:10, 4:11 or so, there was a very important incident that happened here in our city, which in turn was in our country, and the entire world paused for this particular event. And I call that event the verdict, right? And when that verdict came down, we have people who remember exactly where they were, exactly what they were doing, exactly what was going on. And it was as if we all took a breath and we held it and listened and we leaned in to see what was going to happen. When that happened, I think a series of things began to happen. And as we think about this show, for those of you who've been following this show, you know that this show is called In the Room Where It Happens, Racism Conversations That Matter to All of Us. And when I say all of us, I mean all of us. I mean the Black of us, the white of us, the Indians of us, the Hmong of us, the Asians of us, all of us. It matters to every person, every human being. And we know from this work that there's only one race, it's the human race. And that the reason why I do this work is because I do believe that humanity is connected, and that when one hurts, I do believe that we all hurt. And the reason that we have racism in this country and in our world, particularly in our society, is because I do believe that we haven't all done the work it takes to eradicate this thing and get it out of our system so that we can truly all have true racial justice, true equity, true equality. And I believe, which is why I keep doing this work and showing up on the screen to you and talking to you, I believe that it is possible. So what I wanted to do tonight is just invite my community in to really come to this conversation, for us to think and talk about the verdict, that verdict that came down on the Floyd case. What happened in that verdict? What were your reactions to that verdict? And as we go into the show, we're going to talk about how that verdict is connected to how racism is not, continues to be, needs to be eradicated in our systems. How does that relate to racism? And then we're going to end our show by saying, now what? We've had the verdict. Now what? Where do we go from here? And I just want to have a conversation. For those of you who are on Facebook and seeing this Facebook Live, please do put your comments in the on Facebook and let us know what you're thinking and hoping and give us your thoughts too. So, Brother Henry, where were you and what were your reactions to the verdict?
Yeah. So. Wow, I mean, that's it. This was absolutely a moment in which everyone around the world that has paid attention to what has happened with the Derek Chauvin trial and everything that happened with George Floyd, you're going to remember where you were when this verdict came down. And so for me, I was at home because hours leading up, we knew the approximate time that they were going to, come out with the verdict, because they said right around like noonish that they had a verdict was in, and it was going to come in between the range of 3:30 to 4 o'clock. And like you said, it came around 4:05. So I was at home and I was ready because this was such a big moment, not just for our state, our city, our country,
Mm-hmm.
the world.
Mm-hmm.
The world
Mm-hmm.
was watching.
The world was watching.
Yeah. And so my reaction to the verdict, I was somewhat surprised, which says a lot about how verdicts typically go in these type of cases. We've been here so many times that most of us couldn't even fathom Derek Chauvin being found guilty on the most serious charge, let alone on all three of the charges. So, you know, and you can see the reaction all around the world was that everybody kind of collectively thought that this possibly could be the beginning of a shift towards real change in terms of law enforcement and accountability with police. So that was my whole initial reaction, was that I was surprised that he was convicted of all three charges. And quite frankly, it was one of those moments where I just kind of exhaled, and I felt, at least for a few moments, like people could really feel like their voices had been heard. From protesting and just being outraged and being upset and letting the world know that this is not right.
And isn't that something that so many of us stood in front of that television and had doubts, real doubts,
Yep,
that anything would ever happen?
Because we put it into a historical, perspective.
We put it in a historical perspective of how things have gone before.
Yep.
And what, and is this really for real? Because, racism, it's systemic. Like, is it really real? Is it really real that our justice systems are beginning to come in line with true equality and true justice? Is it really real? For us to really ask that question. And I stood with my children in the living room, and I, made them sit down. I'm like, listen, because this is a moment for you, for your history. You're going to remember this moment. And this moment, hopefully, is a moment of many moments, right? So I just wanted us to think and talk about it. I have some amazing guests with me from the community in a variety of ways. Well, and my first guest is actually my husband, because he and I had to have the conversation in our house. He was talking, I was talking, he had his conversations, and we were thinking and talking about this thing and saying, we got to do the show. Like, yes, we have got to do the show on the verdict. So I'm going to welcome in my husband, Brother Shane Martin Price, who is a homegrown, African-American man from Minneapolis, have been here, have seen it, have been through it. So I wanted to welcome his perspective to share about the verdict. And what were your reactions, sweetheart, to the verdict?
Well, honey, thank you for having me on your show. I'm so proud of you and the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And Mr. Lake, it's good to meet you and put a face with the voice. And I remembered your presentation from last time or a time ago, and was connecting to your story real well. So thank you. The verdict was huge. It was huge in so many ways, and I think Mr. Lake talked about it being a worldwide announcement. And one of the things that we have been hoping for, we as people of color, because we've experienced this in the past. We've seen this before. We've been at this movie before, and it always ends the same way with, no charges. And, this was our gas, because we believe somehow, we didn't want to believe it. Intellectually, we saw what we saw, but spiritually, we've been down the road. And so for me, I think that I saw accountability meted for the behavior of that particular officer. I'm not anti-police, so I just have to say that. I believe it said, blessed are those that are called the son, that are peacemakers, they would be called the sons of God. I believe that some people are called into that profession. I'm not anti-police, but I was anti that behavior that the officer exhibited. I think for our discussion tonight and for the discussion going forward, we have to be able to separate the difference between justice and accountability. And, many have shouted, well, we finally got justice. And I get what they mean. But what I think, if they had more time to process, I think they might be saying, hey, we have gotten accountability. Justice would have been that Floyd lived through that experience, right? But justice is about morality, right? And righteousness. And, and all of us fall short of that mark. But the idea is that we continue to press forward to that higher calling of a just lifestyle, a just way to live our lives and to deal with other people. I do think that he was met at accountability and accountability under the law as prescribed by the Constitution of the United States. I'll stop right there.
Sweetheart, I'm so glad that you said you're not anti-police, because I think that's a very important distinction here in this conversation, is that holding anyone, police, judges, teachers, business people, holding anyone accountable for true crimes is the right thing to do.
Right.
Right. And so this conversation is not about being anti-police at all. Not whatsoever. But the question becomes, are we really providing the level of, like you said, accountability, which creates justice, if enough of it is meted out? Because then I know that, when our son goes out there, I know that he can be meted a level of justice from any officer that he meets, because they know the difference now. They know that it's the right thing to do, to treat all people, regardless of who's in that car, like they're a human being. They know that now, right?
And that is the just morality of it all, but maybe not yet the truth across the board. And we've had multiple shootings since the passing of George Floyd. Multiple African-American men have been shot by the police. And so one has to wonder what is really taking place here, what's really at foot.
Yes.
And I'll say one other thing and then I'll stop. And that is many in the United States military have been meted out who have KKK and other affiliations, and people are starting to respond to them systemically. I have a feeling, as a native of Minneapolis and a North Sider, that some of that has also dripped into the Minneapolis and maybe even the St. Paul police force. And beginning to address that, I think, is a good thing for the police who are called to be there, because the other element is causing everybody to look really, really bad. And I think something has to be done to separate out those two. I'll stop.
Absolutely.
Can I say one thing, Dr. Price? I just want to say one thing. I know we have other guests that we're going to bring on. I just want to I
knew you were jumping, Henry Lake. I knew you were going to do it.
I just wanted to say to Brother Shane that I agree with him 100%, because I'm so glad that he stated that he is not anti-police, because look, the reality is that the language that many people use in mainstream media and what has been promoted throughout the years are that people of color specifically are anti-police, and we know that that's not true.
Not true.
We are anti-bad policing.
Right.
I have never once uttered the phrase "abolish the police." People use the different other slogans, whether it's abolish the police, defund the police, however you want to look at it. You want good police officers patrolling all communities.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's all that we ask for. We're not asking for anything other than that. Right. And when we talk about looking at different examples, one of the things that people of color and others, okay, allies, our white allies have said is just look at the disparity between how people of color are treated and white Americans are treated. We saw the situation in Hutchinson.
Right.
I applauded those police officers because they showed amazing restraint and they did not take that gentleman's life. All that we ask is that when you're interacting with people of color, be able to use those same de-escalation tactics the same way that you do with white Americans.
Absolutely. There was a great comment in the Facebook chat. Just, and I think it kind of gets to our second question. Which says we must hold all accountable for true crimes. I agree, but they do not look. They, meaning police officers, do not look at all African Americans as crime free. What would it be like if we looked at all the police officers, all the cops as bad? Same thing, right? So this has to go both ways. This has to go both ways. And there is a paradigm shift that must take place, which is why we're talking about the verdict. Now what? I'm going to bring in another voice in this conversation, and he's a longtime North Sider. His family lives in North Side, and they have persisted through many things. And I know his mom. I love his mom, Joanne Lundgren, and I got to know him and his family through his mama. And so I'm going to have Jonathan Lundgren to join the conversation. And the verdict, Jonathan, what was going through your mind, and what are your reactions?
Wow, that's a big question, right, for all of us. Well, again, and thank you all for the honor of being here. It is truly an honor to be part of this conversation. I knew Floyd when I was my previous employer for the last 14 years was a Northside nonprofit housing organization.
Right.
And part of what we did was build new homes for families on the North Side. And for a month, in fall of 2019, George Floyd was a carpenter with us, and I worked side by side with him for a month, framing a home. So I got to know him, and I got to know his character. And so this verdict, though, being a longtime North Sider and having seen the inequities everywhere, not just in the police force, but the ways in which I was treated and the ways in which my neighbor and friends and pastors were treated, who were people of color. So this was both a very corporate decision where feeling this sense of community, not just on the North Side, not just in Minneapolis and Minnesota, but as you, Mr. Lake, indicated, the global nature of this decision. But this was also a very personal decision too, because I grew to really like him. He was a hard worker and showed his character, at least to me, on our job site on a daily basis. And so this was a very personal thing for me as well. And I kind of, as everybody has kind of stated too, remembered where you were. I saw all of our kind of neighborhood text chains come through that the verdict was going to come out between 3:30 and 4. I was in the car with my daughter, picking her up from school on the way to daycare to pick up my little one. And so I was on 55 headed into the city. So I didn't have the opportunity to pull over to hear it because it was in the midst of traffic. But as the judge came on and began to speak, I recognized and again, based, being in the North Side for the last year as well, my family has been subject to a lot of the violence. We have a couple of bullet holes in our house to prove it. We have experienced gunfire on a daily basis. The escalation has affected our family greatly. And so I felt the welling up not only of some of the angst and tension with that, but also of history. I've lived in communities of color as a minority for the last 20-ish years. And so I have been proximate to a lot of that trauma. And though I would never begin to attempt to identify, and I can't. I have recognized within my own self this idea of compassion fatigue, this psychological thing that if you're around something enough, even though you're not experiencing it yourself, we as human beings just tend to take on some of that. And I felt myself holding my breath when the judge came on, because there's a stereotypical statement about high hopes and low expectations, because I live blocks away from where Jamar Clark was killed.
Right.
Have dear friends who were families with Philando Castile. Recognize that I have friends who have been assaulted by the police. And so I was hopeful, because people leading up to it kept asking me, this is the one, right? Like, this is the one where we get a conviction. And I kept wanting to say yes. But I couldn't bring myself to, and so I did. I found myself welling up with anxiety and what if scenarios, and it can't happen this time again. And then I was holding my daughter's hand. I remember when she was sitting in the passenger seat, and when the judge said the first count, guilty, and then went through the whole thing, second count, guilty. I, as others around the world have said, that I just this massive exhale. And I did tear up and then look down at my daughter, and my first thought was, maybe this will change.
Right.
Maybe this will do it. Maybe policing will change, and maybe my little girl will grow up in a world she doesn't have to fear the police. Statistically speaking, she will never have to fear the police. But her dear friends, her best friends, will. And so my thought and hope was, coming out of that one, yes, the enormous exhale, and then the enormous hopes for the future that our kids will grow up in a place where, I mean, even as Dr. King famously said, right, that they will literally be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And that is an enormous hope.
Wow. You know what, John, I had no idea. I had no idea that you even knew George Floyd. But I can tell you, literally, I was thinking and praying on this show. And literally out of nowhere, you just popped right up in my face. Like literally out of nowhere. I'm like, why am I thinking of John Leonard? Like there you were, like right in front of my face. And I was like, he's the one. He is the one. He has something to say about this. You know, what comes from your conversation, I think, is that word hope for me. Hope. And that verdict just kind of opened up a little hope in me. I'm like, well, you know what? Yeah, there's a possibility here. There is a possibility here. There's a potential that we could be headed toward true justice. There's a potential here. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to just bring another voice into the conversation. And she is my good friend, and she has been there, and I have worked with her, and we do all kinds of projects together. And she's funny, but let me tell you, she's brilliant. She's like a mastermind. And Miss Shaletta Brundage, who is just always has profound things to say in her own way. And I know that you've got amazing things to bring to this conversation. So for you, that verdict, I know you were listening because you are a media mind. And what were you thinking? What were your reactions to it? What went through you?
I was afraid initially. I actually called my husband and told him to come home from work early. I brought my children inside because I didn't know what to expect. And so we gathered around as a family together with my children, who are 14, 8, 7, and 6. To watch what would happen so we could talk about history in real time.
Wow.
And, we talk about the talk that African-American parents have to give their boys and the rules and regulations that we have to give them so they can understand how to interact with police, because police officers oftentimes don't know how to interact with us. So we have to train them. And even with the best training, if they meet the worst officer, they still might take it. And so my boys were glad. My husband was relieved. We live all the way in Cottage Grove, 45 minutes away from George Floyd Square. But still, the Walmart was boarded up. And for so long, people have turned a blind eye to racism. They have not said anything to their bosses or friends or their neighbors or their church members who have been racist and who have done things against African Americans because they thought that it didn't apply to them. This doesn't impact me. Sure. And now it is impacting everyone because it's impacting our economy. It's impacting our city. You know, Bloomington looks like Beirut. You know, downtown Minneapolis looks like Mogadishu because we have for so long turned a blind eye to racism, police injustice, and all of those things that we thought didn't impact us. And now we are paying a price for that.
Yes,
in suburbs and cities across the country, not just in the Twin Cities.
Wow. Ms. Shaletta, we're going to come back to more of what you're sharing, because there's some really big things there to think about. We have one other guest I want to bring into the conversation, and that is Miss Pamela. And I don't know Miss Pamela. It's my first time actually seeing her in person here on the screen, but our good friend Roxanne Smith, a good colleague of mine and one of our board members for Girls Taking Action, recommended Miss Pamela. So Miss Pamela, the verdict, where were you? What are your reactions? And then I may have to interrupt you a little bit as we go into break, but then we'll come right back to you. Go ahead.
I think she's muted.
You're muted, Miss Pamela. Hit that unmute button. Just hit that little button, Ms. Pamela. There you go. There you go.
I was saying thank you very much for Dr. Verna for having me on. It's so wonderful to be here. Yeah, I was on that couch. My husband and I were clutching each other. And as the verdict came down, we just cried. So much tension. And it just felt like such a release that I think like crying was just the only way of expressing that relief. I also, I've been worrying some about the people who were in the courtroom all those days, reliving that horrendous torture and execution. And I heard on the radio, one of the jurors today was speaking about how their attention was completely focused on sort of having to go through all that again. So I hope all those folks are getting what they need in terms of healing. But I tell you, afterwards, I could feel the difference between if Derek Chauvin had not been convicted, it would have been an emotional hole to climb out of. I just could feel. So I felt hope too. I felt like there's hope. There's momentum. I think Mr. Price said it's can put the gas on the pedal now. Like I feel that. I feel a renewed conviction to move on the work of reducing the likelihood of that kind of torture and execution ever happening again. So,
wow, and Ms. Pamela, you are actually a community activist. So you've been in this thing.
Well, so yeah, I'm a longtime community organizer. I'm 35 years right now, though. The organizing I'm doing is in my neighborhood, is in Ward 12 in Minneapolis, and I'm really focused on organizing my white neighbors around their stake in ending racism, and particularly ending racism in the public safety system.
Ms. Pam, you hold on to that because we are coming back.
Yep. And the conversation is just starting. So, this is a great conversation here. I'm loving every second of it. This is the Race and Racism Conversation Series, in the room where it happened, conversations on racism that matter to all of us. And we're talking about how we're dealing with racism and specifically everything that's gone on since the Derek Chauvin verdict that occurred just last week. We're going to take a brief pause here at the top of the hour, come back more with our host, Dr. Werner Price, and our roundtable next year on News Talk 830 WCCO. Okay. All right, win the break. Oh, Dr. Price? Okay. All right, welcome back to News Talk 830 WCCO. This is our conversation on race and racism, that series, In the Room Where It Happened, conversation on racism that matters to all of us. I am Henry Lake alongside Dr. Werner Price, and it's a pleasure to be with you guys this evening here on the Good Neighbor News Talk 830 WCCO with our esteemed roundtable that we have for the remaining hour here of the show. Dr. Price?
Oh, thank you so much, Brother Henry Lake.
Conversation.
I appreciate you. Yes, I do. Our conversation, really this next level, we have our reaction to the verdict. Now the question becomes, reaction is not enough. We now have to think about how is it connected? Because, you know, in our system, what often happens, because we live in a quick, instant sort of, the next thing sort of society. And so as soon as that next thing is done, then we forget it happened. And then we move on to the next thing, right? Until the next tragedy happens the next. And I want us to make this connection. How we learn and grow and change as we make connections between things, because then we become intentional about creating the change. And so the connection I want our panel to make is, what is the connection between this verdict and systemic and individual racism? What's the connection? And I'm going to start with Ms. Shaletta. What do you think, Ms. Shaletta?
I think the connection is a wake-up call. It's a reckoning. The veil's been lifted. Some of the things that African Americans have been telling their white friends and coworkers for decades, they finally saw when they watched that 9 minutes and 46 seconds that Derek Chauvin had his neck on George Floyd's knee, his knee on his neck. And everybody around him was powerless to help. And the people who had power refused to. I had so many of my friends that I had been talking to for years, that I raised my kids with, finally call me and say, I get it. I understand what you were saying. Just an example, my son Daniel is 6 years old. He has autism and he sees a therapist every day virtually. And so I sit with him as his assistant. And she was showing him some community helpers one day. And she showed him a teacher, a mailman, and a police officer. And she said, which one of them is going to help you if you get into trouble? And my son was stumped, right? Because none of these people, he didn't identify any of them. It was a trusted adult or a parent. And so I had to interject into the therapy session and say, my son is not going to get this answer, and here's why. And at the time, she didn't understand it. But after she saw that video, she actually called me back and told me, I get it now. So it's an awakening and an understanding of the problems that African Americans in this country have faced, how we have still gone to work, how we have done it with a smile, how we have persevered. They see it now instead of us just saying it.
Yeah. Now, Miss Pamela, you were about to make this connection yourself, because you said you're talking to your white neighbors, right?
Yeah. I mean, we're having a conversation that everyone is invited to. We had a training last night called "Safety is Communal: From Fear to Focus" on the neuroscience of fear, and everyone was invited to that. But I think there's an opportunity right now. There's a new energy for uprooting old systems, for questioning things that we take for granted, like what actually makes us safe, what would a public safety system that address the things that don't make us safe actually look like. I don't think it's anti-police to say that our public safety doesn't need to be solely police dependent. And I also think more white people are ready to understand and embrace their stake in ending racism and understanding white supremacy as a divide and rule strategy perpetuated by those at the top of the economic hierarchy. We live in an apartheid-based society. Like, we're all assigned a race, and we kind of look at our self-interest through that lens. And so I think we would, I want white people to understand more about their histories. I've learned more about the history of whiteness. Like, I don't think the stuff we learn in history books is the history of white people. I think it's the origin story from the perspective of the dominant power, right? It's like, it's kind of a propaganda piece, really. So, understanding more about the origins of whiteness and how it was used to move people from a class consciousness to a race consciousness is very agitational.
Yeah.
Important.
But, Ms. Pamela, it's amazing how many of us were never taught any good history. You know what I mean? Like we just don't know the history of our people, of our country, of our land. We just don't know it. I mean, the whole thing, right? And a people, you are the result. You are a product of the whole package. People talk about racism, but the truth is that we're all traumatized by racism, aren't we? White people are traumatized by racism, which results in certain behaviors. And Black people are traumatized by racism, which results in a certain type of behaviors, right? We all have been impacted by this thing. And to say, now what's going to be our part? It's going to be really, really important. I'm going to quick introduce my husband into the conversation, and then we're going to go back and come back to you and then have John to kind of help us figure this thing out too. What do you think, sweetheart?
Well, I appreciated Pamela's comments. I really did. And I think white folks have to do their own work. And I mean that in a loving way. Right? In that we have been charged with having to do our work and then help you do our work too. And the responsibility is too great now. And so there's a lot of folks who are turned off to trying to, coach white people into understanding what is taking place. Some people are fed up with that. And I just want to go back and say there's one important thing, at least important in my mind. I am still frightened by what would have happened if the verdict would have went the other way.
Absolutely.
And I'm saying that because I believe good, hardworking, intelligent, brilliant, loving Black folks would have had to face a reality that we really don't want to have to face, and that is that this Constitution, this is not working for us, and we're too intelligent now to continue to play the game, and that reality for me was frightening. To the bridge that my wife is talking about, I want to build this bridge. I see a bridge between the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol and the behavior at George Floyd Square. Right? I see that bridge clearly, right? And I think the same spirit that involved itself in the insurrection is the same policing spirit that we experienced on 38th in Chicago. I'm gonna wait for all the amens to die down on that. I'll say this one more thing, and then I'll pass, sweetheart, and that is, that the impact that Shaletta talked about is so powerful. Folks were starting to get it. But as Pamela indicates, getting it is one thing, holding on to it, honey, is another.
It's a whole other thing.
Doing the work that Pamela's talking about is really what gets us to our ultimate next level. I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Yes, go ahead.
Let's hold that thought, and then we'll come back after a brief pause. We'll continue the conversation in the room where it happened, conversations on racism that matter, here on News Talk 830 WCCO. All right, welcome back to In the Room Where It Happened, conversations on racism that matter. My name is Henry Lake alongside Dr. Verna Price. That was a very brief pause. We want to jump right back into the conversation, Dr. Price. It's too good right now.
I know. And the comments that are coming on Facebook is great, right? Ann Nikolai, and I know Ann, she is from all the way from San Miguel, Mexico, listening. And she said, this is the best conversation ever. And then we just had someone else come on and saying the only thing, love this, that should be, so, okay, Jeffrey Stewart. Hey, Jeffrey, the only thing that should be separated by color is laundry. Jeffrey, amen to that. Amen to that. I'm going to go back to Jonathan Lundberg to help us make his thoughts on this connection between the verdict and systemic and individual racism. What is that connection so we can help people see it? Go ahead. John, you are talking. I had great things, but that you got to unmute.
You think after a year of doing digital meetings, we get this.
You're doing great.
Get this. Sorry about that.
That's good.
That is a connection that I hope will be made, right? Yeah. And so coming out of this, and specifically speaking as a white community member, maybe not on behalf of all my white community members, but we got a lot of work to do, as Brother Shane you've indicated, and we have to do our own work. We can't be dragged along by those that are living this out, and so in this connection, I have a concern and I have a hope. My concern is that what happens in the coming weeks and months, kind of in this microwave mentality that you've indicated. My concern is what happens now is what happened after President Obama was elected. Hey, we have a black president now. We fixed it, right? Racism is fixed. My concern is that the verdict has come down, and my white brothers and sisters, community members, will look at this going, okay, we fixed racial injustice. We have now convicted a police officer. We're good, right? And not continue to do the work. My hope is that, as Dr. Price, as you've brought up, that this connection is made. And I've seen this connection with some of my white family members, some of my white brothers and sisters in community, that more so than in the past, I have recognized eyes opening to, ooh, so this is a thing, huh? Right, and I've had more conversations about that with family, not people that have come all the way yet to recognizing that there is systemic racism. Right. I think there's still a big leap there for a lot of white community members. But my hope then, in that making that connection, is that more people make this connection because of this video and because of this step forward than would have if George Floyd wouldn't have lost his life. And my analogy there is, I remember when I had I worked for an African-American civil rights leader from the South named Dr. John M. Perkins, who wrote an autobiography about his civil rights days called Let Justice Roll Down. And I gave it to my grandparents. Super white, super Swedish, northern Wisconsin, like it doesn't get more northern Wisconsin. They lived on Lake Superior. And I gave them, and they read that book, and they recalled for me when they first recognized that something was going on in the South that they had never recognized before. Like, there were no black people in their town. My parents didn't grow up with any people of color around them. And so when the video came on the news of the dogs being released on the crowd and the children and the fire hoses and all of those things, they had a moment of eye-opening where, ooh, that's a thing. And it, obviously we know now the needle didn't go as far as it needed to go. We didn't solve everything. A lot left to, but I hope that this is the next in the stage of realizations that can push people forward to recognize what, of course, our brothers and sisters of color have been saying forever.
Yeah.
This is a thing. This is real. It needs to be worked on. And white folks, my prayer and my mission is for white family in my community, as my sister Pamela is doing too, we've got some work to do so that because we still statistically hold so much of that power, we need to be the ones that push that shift.
Yeah. You know something, when you were talking, John, it just reminded me of, because I've heard this before, right? That, well, everything's fine where we are, right? There's no problems here. And it's almost as if we're living in these like separate little universes, right? That are just kind of like spiraling around each other. And when things like the tragedy, the murder of George Floyd happens, just for an instant, those universes begin to collide onto each other, right? So like they begin to kind of interconnect with one another. And for the first time, you see a glimpse into the reality, into my reality. And the fact is that my reality is shaped by your reality because there's this larger system that is pushing all of this to a certain, in a certain direction that if you're not really aware of it, and if you've really never had a conversation about it or thought about it, I think to myself, when was the last time that the police force actually in their training in their training actually conducted racism conversations with their new inductees? Has that ever happened? Has there ever been a conversation where you had to go through a series of conversations where you have to do that work? Has that really ever happened? So for your grandparents, their universe came now in contact with yours. And for a moment, they had to consider maybe there is another world going out there, right? There may be something.
Proximity.
Yes, this connection.
Can I answer the question real quick? I'll be brief. When you talk about impacting systemic and individual racism, without legislation and politicians putting their money where their mouth is, we won't see change. And I hate to have a pessimistic view on the issue, but we have to force their hand. And police departments, police unions have shown us that they won't change. We've seen that. Politicians have shown us that too. And that's why people wanted to get all upset at Maxine Waters because she talked about confrontational. This is what she's talking about, though, is because we are at a point where we need to be able to move forward. And the stuff that was done in July here with the legislature and them talking about reform, they're giving us crumbs. We need some real change. Stop giving us lip service. We don't need that here in Minnesota where this went down. And so for us to move forward, we gotta do more, and we gotta be better about it.
And the one thing, Dr. Verna, that continues to frustrate me is that our leaders go from crisis to crisis. So when George Floyd happened, they were leading from the lectern. They had their suits on, they had their ties on, and they were giving briefings and updates. And nobody went down to where the people were hurting, where they were grieving, where they were upset. Nobody went down there for a week. And the same thing happened when Dante Wright died. How is it that Jesse Jackson with Parkinson's disease made it from Chicago to Brooklyn Center before our governor, our local mayors, our entire DC-led delegation, and our state senators and representatives? Nobody went down there and hugged anybody. They just kept giving us these briefings from the lectern, from St. Paul, in the press room. and they were not connected to the community. So you're telling me that we built $500,000 worth of barbed wire and concrete barricades and fences to protect the courthouse, but we haven't spent $1 to build bridges with the community. And people feel that. They feel the distance in that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which are like the question of the now what? How do they make those connections with true community? Because and the work is in true community is where the change is going to happen, right? And I say over and over again, where there's no will in the people, then the law must legislate. And with racism, if there's no will, then and the law won't legislate, we almost have to like switch it back to the people, to the regular community people to push that. So people say, well, why have protests? Are protests even still necessary? Is it still even needed for people to protest? Well, that's a good question. Let's take a break and come back to that. Is it still needed? And now what following the verdict? We're going to come back with you, Ms. Pam.
All right, welcome back to News Talk 830 WCCO. This is our conversation series, Race and Racism, in the room where it happened, being led by Dr. Verna Price, and she's been doing a phenomenal job for months, really leading us on this journey to educate ourselves and just have those difficult conversations to better our community in our state. Dr. Price, I don't know where you want to pick up
yes.
right now.
Yes, I actually want to go to Ms. Pam to think and talk with us a little bit. And then someone sent us a note in the chat and said, what really does we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal? Like, what exactly does that mean? Exactly does that mean today, right now? What does that mean following the verdict? Right now. So, but Ms. Pam, we're going to go and help us think and talk about like what now? What do we do now?
So I'm so energized by this conversation. So the thing about movements is like on any issue you can think of, somebody right now is organizing around it, right? Yeah. There are people who've been organizing for decades for a more equitable and just public safety system.
Yes.
And so what I'm excited about is that with the opening we have to reimagine how we do public safety, there are, at least for those of us in Minneapolis, there's going to be some options on the ballot this fall, right, for a charter amendment. And there's also a lot of voices for the status quo. Saying we don't need to, and I feel like there's a framing sometimes of this issue that is Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, which is not a framing that helps anyone, right? That is a framing that cements the status quo, because it doesn't need to be a choice. What if we have a world where Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter?
Right.
Like,
come on now.
Imagine that. Right?
Okay, now, Miss Pam, I'm gonna get some Kleenex. In the Black church, we would just get a Kleenex and start waving it for you. Tell it.
Yes, I think whether like the jury's out on what's going to happen in Minneapolis, like either we're going to keep the status quo or we're going to just try something new. And even a little, I feel like the charter amendment has been proposed as a little tiny thing in a big structural problem. Like, let's entertain the idea, but it's only going to really be entertained if us and everybody listen, if a critical mass of people demand that it be entertained. And so that's that's the work I'm committed to. Like now to the end of the year is like, we have got to push hard and make use of this precious moment that we have to think differently, to reimagine what public safety is, and to talk about how racism works in systems.
Absolutely. And what you just said, Ms. Pam, is that racism is working in these systems. And I think we just need to say that, right? Just be real clear about that. Because I was just talking to someone, actually Ann Nicolai from San Miguel, and she said, Dr. Verna, you're always talking about the work we have to do. What is this work? And to your, maybe to your, white person who's listening, they don't know what the work is. And so And so we've got to describe exactly what is the work we want you to do. Go ahead.
Can I say one more thing? Yeah. So it's not, I think most of the work is not actually for, it's not demonstrating the streets. I think it's having deep conversations, neighbor to neighbor, right? It's saying, what are the things that, when I ask my neighbors what actually makes you feel unsafe, it's things like my garage got broken into. I saw a person having a mental health breakdown and I thought, I can't call the police. Like, what? How do we have a society where somebody's having a mental health breakdown and there's no one to call? How is that public safety? That's not. And so, it's having those kinds of conversations all over, in backyards, on Zoom, wherever we can have them, all over the city. Like, that is the conversation. I think it's less about being in the streets right now and more about connecting to one another.
Oh, wow. No, that's good. Who's going to jump in? This is good stuff.
Who are we connecting to? Who are we connecting to, though? Because good. I loved Pamela's comment, because she's spot on. We have to reimagine all of this. And to me, that's a deep thought. It's deeper than what people want to acknowledge, because I personally have an issue with the overall culture with law enforcement. And I don't believe that every police officer is a bad cop or a bad person or a bad human being or anything like that. But we have way too many individuals that are in the profession that utilize just the heavy-handed tactics and aren't truly about the profession of protecting and serving. Let me read this to you real quick. This is from the New York Times. They got a video that showed Colorado police officers laughing at body camera footage of an arrest of a 73-year-old woman with dementia. The woman said in a lawsuit that the police had broken a bone in her arm and dislocated her shoulder. How is the police culture? You can watch that and laugh at it. So we have to reimagine how we're going to deal with the citizens that we're supposed to be protecting in every single way. When I go down to Whole Foods downtown Minneapolis now, there are not Minneapolis police officers in there anymore. There are security people with peace hoodies on that are being peaceful people that are overlooking everything. So that's what Pam was talking about.
Wow.
And this is the thing too, is that, we've seen how police understand and know how not to use heavy-handed tactics in other communities. However, when they come to predominantly communities of color, or when they encounter a person of color, it's quick. We got 60 seconds before something happens. We've got 20 seconds to explain ourselves. Everything is so fast and so quick, and the patience is not there. And so I look at the fact that Derek Chauvin, who has a police file, right? And we've seen, after the trial was over, how he, put his knee on a 14-year-old boy's back for 17 minutes. And, some other instances that have come out since the verdict in investigative reporting by some of our local journalists. And think about this. This is news to us. We're all shocked. We can't believe this happened, right? But the Minneapolis Police Department knew this, and they made him a training officer. He is in charge of training other officers on how to do community policing. This person, they had his file. They knew his history, but still they elevated him to a point where he was in charge of teaching other officers how to police, especially communities of color. So what is he teaching them? What are they learning? How will they implement that when they come across my son who has a hoodie on and wants to put his hands in his pocket just because it's cold outside and he thinks he's too cool for a coat, so he wants to wear his hoodie and put his pants in his pocket, but all of a sudden the straight A student who's never missed a day of school looks like a suspect because he has his hands in his pocket. So we have to go back to look at the system of policing, especially right here in Minnesota, that would elevate someone like Derek Chauvin with his record to a training officer.
Right. So what I want you to do, though, and what we're doing, Ms. Shalata, is like just dig deep and drill down in that. So like what is the river that's flowing under there that's actually producing that, right? Yeah. Because somewhere in that system, go ahead, Jonathan, you're trying to like jump in. I see you.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly there.
To the screen.
From And recognizing from the white community too. I mentioned before, for 13, 14 years, I worked for a nonprofit housing organization over north that would rehabilitate multi-unit and single families structures for lower income families. And we would go to the city council and go to Hennepin County, and we would try to get whatever money, whatever pennies they would give us to fix housing. And we would get that, just pennies, right? But then all of a sudden, the Vikings threatened to leave. And they gave the Minnesota Vikings $500 million. And so our statement about housing was, until we as a people, because we put these people there and we tell them what to do, essentially, until we collectively hate homelessness and houselessness and placelessness more than we love the Vikings, we won't see change. So I see the same thing. We don't have a money problem as much as people say. We don't have a money problem. We have a will problem. Because we have to will this to change. And Mr. Lake, you indicated this as well, that until we love justice more than we hate being uncomfortable with these conversations, with these dialogues, and until we value Black and brown bodies more than we, again, hate those conversations, we won't see change, which goes back to Ms. Pamela's conversation about essentially what you're saying. What I hear you saying, Ms. Pamela, is through these conversations and dialogues and all these things, we have to change hearts and minds. Because
go ahead,
once we get to the grassroots level of changing the hearts and minds of those people that do the electing, and even especially those ones that do the nominating, that find the people that we put in office, until those hearts and minds come around and change, we're going to be fighting this again, unfortunately. And so it really does, I believe, to come down to, we have to change laws, have to change legislation, but we also have to, it starts at that grassroots.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, sweetheart. You jumped into the screen too. I love it.
I appreciate, Jonathan's comments are important, and I'm going to tell you why. Well, for a lot of reasons. But around the nation, where new stadiums have been built in large cities, those stadiums have also generated gentrification around the building of those stadiums. And for those of us like Jonathan and I, we're from here in Minneapolis. Minneapolis downtown looks a whole lot different. You know what I mean? And construction is underway. It's a completely different place in some ways from my youth. Downtown Minneapolis, but the same problem is in all other states where the stadium has come in. The expectation is that gentrification supports the investment of those stadiums, and that the police are to protect those large investments with those heavy-handed strategies. I'm just going to stop with that. But let me go on to say that this, and that is that the intrinsicness of racism, you have to almost pull with a tweezer, in these systems. I can remember when WCCO radio would not have accommodated a talk show like this one, and I appreciate that there's been some changes made that allow this kind of conversation to take place. And I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'll stop. And that is, I don't want to overlook the white folks who were in the street protesting right away, not a day later or something like that, but got it right away, jumped right on it and stayed right on it. And while there were some dynamite activists who I really appreciate, who drove home some nails, I actually know that it might not have been so had not the white folks stepped up and clearly said, you know what, yeah, this is wrong as 9 left feet, and we're getting ready to get out here with you, and we're not leaving either. And if that's you and you're listening, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you for helping to generate this discussion and to push us to a place where individual and systemic change could take place. Thank you.
Absolutely. There is, you know, and that one of the risks of having these conversations is that, you know, it's easy to lump everyone into one group, right? It just is. It's easy to lump every police officer into the destroy Black men group. It's easy to do that. And we just want to make it clear to our listeners that that is not the work here, right? The work here is for us to think about how at every level we can eradicate this thing. Every level. Right?
It goes back to the public schools. I think it was last year, Jonathan, or the year before, rejected teaching African American history in the school, and so just think about what that means. It means that we're going to perpetuate the misconception and the lie, and we're not going to allow any of those things that might be seen as threatening to someone. We're not going to allow those things to take place in the Minneapolis public schools. And I think that's challenging at least, but dangerous at best, because if a person doesn't know who they are, they certainly are going to behave in a way that you don't want. And so we have to be, and so to the point of specific intrinsic racism and systems, here's a example that's hot off the press.
Absolutely.
That's important. I love that, because Jonathan and Mr. Price are talking about priorities, and we should all have our priorities in line, right? But we don't in this country, not just in this city or in this state, but in this country. But let me throw some facts out there, just so people have some facts. And you can go to mappingpolicingviolence.org. Black people are most likely to be killed by police, and 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed than white people. Police have killed to date this year in 2021 alone in this country, 335 people. And last but not least, between 2013 to 2020, I looked at the graph today, and it showed that police killed Black people at higher rates than white people in 47 of the 50 largest U.S. cities. Minneapolis was at the top of the list, followed by Chicago, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Raleigh. Those are facts.
Got it. And I mean, those are hurtful and deadly facts, because behind each one of those names is a black family, or a family who mourning their children and who will deal with that trauma throughout the rest of their lives. And so those are disturbing. But let me just say this: we would be willing to help to organize an anti-racist training designed specifically for European community. Just help put it together and get it out there, Jonathan and Miss Pamela, and then allow leadership to evolve from inside, so that it could go in whatever direction it would want to go. I just want to share, because we're talking about how do we get to that point, and that's what I would be willing to do to help.
And we're involved in this work. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, through a lot of my training too, I've done a lot of work in intercultural competency over the last 5-6 years or so. And I've started through lots of different notes and things, trying to do that same exact thing, trying to recognize that, looking back in my journey as a where I grew up, like suburban, middle class, northern, white, heterosexual, name all your stereotypes. I'm the walking manifestation of it. And what did it take for me to get here?
Right.
What do I wish I would have known 25, 30 years ago? What would it have taken to get me here quicker? And, what kind of mental Olympics did I have to go through in order to get over those hurdles? And I've been jotting those notes too, because there is a very specific journey that white folks need to go through in order to see. Absolutely. Because it takes a while for us to see. And there are certain things we're not equipped to. We don't have the proximity. We don't have the eyes. We don't have the training. And we need those things. And those, yes, we need a effective curriculum for white folks' eyes to be illuminated to this.
Absolutely.
I'm so glad you said that, because people ask all the time, what can I do? After George Floyd died, my son's therapist, our neighbors, they came knocking on my door and said, what can I do? How can I help? And, my immediate reaction was, get yourself a friend. Not a black coworker, not a black neighbor. I mean, Jonathan's laughing because he already know he got him a black friend. You have to have a black friend who you love, who loves you, whose wedding you attended, who you attended their children's baptism. Y'all have eaten at each other's house. Y'all have taken y'all shoes off at each other's houses. And even when you were no longer co-workers, you are still friends. Because when you have those conversations with your black friend, you can see it from a human and personal perspective versus a news story is trying to tell you something, a Dr. Verner's trying to tell you, or Shaletta's trying to tell you. When your black friend tells you that they fear for their son's life, you have empathy for them, and you understand that. And my friend Susie Pahowski and I, when I moved to Minnesota, before we got married, before we started having children, we've been on this journey of motherhood and friendship together. And we've had these talks, and she thought I was crazy lady because I was teaching my 3-year-old child how to interact with police at 3 years old. And so now that she sees, I just want to quick read this text. I'm getting old, so I have to take my glasses off. She said, several years ago, you challenged my assumptions about law enforcement, and you were vulnerable enough to share your fear for your family. And in the same time, that conversation, not a big thing, has changed or gotten better. You're the hardest working person I've ever met. And on top of all you do for work, family, and your budding media empire, you're educating people on social media and with your show. Your willingness to share pain and educate people will make a difference, has made a difference. This burden of this education should be on white people, but you continue to show up. I'm here for you, and I'm grateful. That conversation started, 14 years ago, Jonathan. And it didn't really come to pass and the veil get lifted until, we watched that George Floyd video. But the beginning is to embrace people who don't look like you, so you can understand the pain that we are going through.
And Ms. Shaletta, I'm going to jump in right there, and I'm going to comment on something that one of our viewers sent a note and said, what does this mean, Dr. Verna? In the Declaration of Independence, our Declaration of Independence, this is our country. Black folks, white folks, Indian folks, Asian folks, Hmong folks, this is our country. This is our country. In our Declaration of Independence, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the Declaration of Independence, the intention, really the core intention, is that all of us have the same rights.
Well, sweetheart.
And when, listen to me carefully, and when racism was put into the structure of saying only certain people, this is intended just for the white people, then we became and had problems. So what I want us as a country, as a system, is to put everybody into this statement, all of us,
right,
and be true to the all, not just all white people, not just all wealthy white men with the money, all people. Whether you are rich or poor or white or black, all people have a right. And here's the reality of it, is that we were created by the same creator. The same creator.
That's
and the
good.
same creator gave us the same rights. And what are our same rights?
Woo.
Life. We all have a right to life. So really what we get to do, the verdict tells us, is that, for me, that there is hope, that there's possibility, that we will all begin to understand that all means all for us. That
Amen.
all men will be created equal when they get stopped. That all men will be created equal in the court system. That all men will be created in the banking system, in the education system. And that is my hope. That is my hope, which is why I continue to do this show. Thank you all so much for coming on tonight. I appreciate you. I love you. Keep doing this work, will you? And we'll all do it together. Thank you, Brother Henry Lake. I appreciate you for co-hosting with me tonight.
Oh, this has been phenomenal. And I want to thank all the guests that have been a part of the panel. You guys have been fabulous. You've really done a phenomenal job. This has been awesome. Thanks to everybody that chimed in and the listening audience, checking us out on the Odyssey app or on News Talk 830 WCCO or the live video stream. Coming up next, we have President Joe Biden gives his first address to Congress.
Yes.
That's coming up next here on News Talk 830 WCCO. Have a wonderful Wednesday. This has been amazing. And look, we're going to continue to keep these conversations coming to you guys.
Absolutely.
All right? We're going to keep
Good night,
doing it.
sweetheart. Good night, Jonathan. Good night, Pamela.
Good night.
All right.